is an author, explorer, conference organizer, video producer, and expedition and tour leader. He is a regular guest on Ancient Aliens, Unexplained, Forbidden History, Ancient Civilizations on Gaia, and the Alaska Triangle, and other TV shows. Hugh, thank you so much for joining us today. As the author of The Giants of Stonehenge and Ancient Britain, and also you are an investigator of over 250 accounts of these remains of giant human skeletons, can you tell me the correlation between Stonehenge and these remains?
Well, yeah, we found over 250 accounts of giant bones, skeletons, skulls, teeth, and everything else all over Britain, and quite a few around the area of Stonehenge. I mean, firstly, Stonehenge, the original name of Stonehenge, recorded in the 12th century, was the Giant's Dance. It was never Stonehenge, that's a later Saxon name. And there's also traditions of a tribe of giants called the Kangig Giants, who were said to have roamed the area and built Stonehenge as a trophy after a great battle that they won. And right near Stonehenge itself, we have a couple of really interesting accounts. One is from 1719 of a 9'4" skeleton being found in a mound near Salisbury called the Giant's Grave. That was the name of the mound. And this is in the greater Stonehenge landscape. We have other accounts, even from 1508, of Sir Thomas Eliot, who was a well-known scholar. He was a MP for Cambridge, and he was actually the first person to write the kind of Latin dictionary, so he was a very well-known person. And he witnessed and was involved in the discovery of a skeleton that was 14 feet 10 inches tall. And other scholars at the time, like John Leland and William Camden, also witnessed this. It was reported, it was written about, talked about until the 1800s. And so that is really intriguing because this is just down the road from Stonehenge. It's part of the greater landscape in that area. And even interestingly, it was found in a giant sort of log wood coffin made of oak. And they found this book with it, with these strange inscriptions, and this metal disc made of tin and lead with similar unusual inscriptions, like a language they couldn't decipher at the time. We think it was Canaanite or Phoenician. That's our suggestion, but we've never seen what the actual inscription was. And so when it comes to Stonehenge, you have these traditions of giants being involved in the construction, as well as giant skeletons being found. And even, you know, the whole story of how it got constructed involved giants bringing the stones over from Africa, North Africa, and placing them at a site called Kilarus in Ireland, before eventually King Ambrosius and Merlin and Uther Pendragon decided to bring the stones over from Ireland and build it on Salisbury Plain as part of a kind of celebration of those that have been slain in battle. Now, this is kind of where it gets a bit odd, because Merlin, who was sometimes referred to as a giant, you know, he actually had to go over and collect the stones using magic and levitation to bring them over. And some traditions have him using engines and gears, like it's some kind of technology, because the 15,000 strong army, led by Uther Pendragon, couldn't move any of the stones when they tried. You know, they just couldn't budge one stone. And so they had to get this magician, wizard kind of guy to do it, Merlin. And so, yes, you have all these connections. You have, like, you know, I question why this isn't more well known. You know, we have well-known scholars finding nearly 15-foot tall skeletons in the area. It's reported by many different people, and yet it's been completely covered up. And so, to me, it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding the kind of this missing chapter in human history that we find here in ancient Britain.
Sounds like it has all the elements of the best movie never made. Why is it being so covered up?
That is a good question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a very strange thing, because we've looked into this. I mean, in America, we have the Smithsonian Institution to blame. They kind of disappeared, removed many of the skeletons and many of the burial remains of the Native Americans. Many of these were giants. In Britain, it's the similar thing. There's like, it doesn't fit in with the timeline of what they want us to believe is British history. It doesn't fit in with various religious and scientific agendas that were emerging at different times in the last few hundred years. A lot of the old Welsh texts and creation myths and foundation stories of Britain involved giants, and they were all part of the Welsh school curriculum up until 100 or so years ago. And yet that got removed and replaced by this English version of history with the kind of Saxons and the royal family and all this kind of stuff, William the Conqueror. But actually, you have to look at the old British text, which are often in Welsh. The Welsh language is really the oldest language here, and it's really the last remnant of what it is to a true kind of British language, apart from Gaelic, perhaps, in Ireland. And so, to me, I think there was a series of agendas that kind of covered it up on their own. I don't think it was a deliberate thing to remove the giants from history, because there's too many accounts that got out in the open. But there's many that should be kind of talked about, should be included in the history books.
And what do these history books tell us about these giants of Stonehenge?
The history books tell us very little. That's the problem. And so we have to kind of dig into the old records. But we do, you know, like you don't get it. Like if you buy a standard book on Stonehenge, they make a joke about it being called the Giant's Dance. They make a joke about kind of this picture, the oldest known depiction of Stonehenge, as a giant lifting one of the stones into place with Merlin and King Ambrosius next to him. So why is the only picture that was around for a long time of Stonehenge, which was part of the History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, it was a later version of that, why is that ignored? Why is that not kind of looked at? And to me, these myths need to be looked at more carefully, these legends, because they hold a kind of oral tradition that goes back thousands of years. And there's truths in there. We just need to decode it properly.
Hugh, one of the themes of this event is the myths of yesterday may confirm the facts of today, or maybe even the science of tomorrow. I find this whole Merlin, magic, levitation stuff really interesting. What can we draw from that myth in application of where we're at today?
So when we come into the stories of Merlin, for instance, I mean, it's a very famous myth. It's a very famous story. He's been around in the British kind of consciousness for many thousands of years. Featured in many movies, obviously. But one of the earliest names of Britain was actually called Merdin's Precinct. Merdin means Merlin, and so that's literally almost before Albion. It was called that before Britain, things like this. So he was a renowned kind of magician, kind of wizard, but also a shaman and a sorcerer. And he was actually, one of the things about him is that he was actually born of this kind of divine race called the incubi. And he was part of this lineage that came from Albina, who was one of the founding kind of almost like princesses of ancient Britain, where her and her 33 sisters were banished from Greece. They came over here and they bred with these incubi, these strange semi-divine beings, and created this race of giants. But they also, the father of Merlin was said to be an incubi, and one of the mothers was the lineage of Albina. And so he had this divine lineage as well. So he had all these magical powers that they were said to have. And so when we talk about him, we see like him using magic, and in some traditions they call it sleight, like the sleight of hand, magic today, and also technologies with descriptions of engines and gears to bring the stones over from Ireland. So you have all these different ideas about who he was, but he was a kind of guiding, almost like a godlike figure of ancient Britain from the very earliest of times. And Merlin, the name itself, might actually be a lineage. It may not be one person, it might not be referring to one person. It may have been the high-level kind of shaman lineage, like the priestly druidic elite, kind of going through from thousands and thousands of years ago. So these are the people who would have kept the secrets of how to build these sites, how to align them to the stars, how to move stones over great distances, how to levitate them potentially, because this is what the kind of stories hint at. So they may have had telekinetic powers, they may have developed psychic powers. So one of the things about Merlin is that he could have had the power to soften, manipulate and carve stone. And his lineage may have had that. It's part of the kind of ancient megalith builders tradition, because we even have stories of the giants, this group called the Canaanic giants who were said to have built Stonehenge, that they could soften, manipulate, and kind of reshape stone, like turning it into a powder. And this is like the modern version of the geopolymer kind of idea, the hypothesis that was created by Joseph Davidovits. So you have all these early traditions that are recorded back in the 1600s that talk about this as well. And so there's something going on here. And I think these myths and stories do have elements of truth, and they do have elements of technology and wisdom encoded within them. We must also remember, regarding Merlin, is that the stones, although they said they came from Ireland, they actually came from West Wales, which in ancient times was kind of part of Ireland, in kind of religious and spiritual terms. And the stones had these healing properties. When you poured water over them, they would then give you a healing, if you placed them on, parts of your body, you drank it and things like this. They had fertility aspects associated with it. And that's why they think they brought the blue stones over. And there's these connections with Merlin with that as well. And so, there's a lot going on with Merlin. I mean, there's been whole books written about him and his lineage, perhaps. And I think the relationship to Stonehenge might actually reflect a time when they had these kind of priestly elites kind of building these sites, constructing these sites with these very special powers.
In terms of debunking conventional or orthodox history regarding Stonehenge, what do you think is your best piece of evidence?
Yeah, when it comes to Stonehenge, there's a lot of talk about, the way they constructed it. It's all very kind of mundane. They had hundreds of people working on it and things like this. And, when you're looking at, eventually now it's been accepted. There's a summer solstice alignment there, for instance, I've just been there celebrating it with 6,000 or 7,000 people. And that took years, decades, for archaeologists to accept that there was any astronomy involved in the site, things like this. And then it got worked on by Gerald Hawkins, before that Norman Lockyer, Robin Heath and others in the more recent times. And they've realized it's a vastly sophisticated calendrical system built into the site, covering the moon cycles, even stars, the sun and the moon, everything you can think of. And so now that's just been accepted by archaeologists, and now they're creating their own versions of that and claiming they've discovered it and things like this. And so you have this kind of delay when the kind of pioneers, often not archaeologists and not anthropologists, come up with these brilliant ideas, and often they're dismissed for many years and then accepted, and then the modern archaeologists will take it on and pretend they kind of came up with it. So you get this a lot going on with Stonehenge and with other sites like this. And so I always find when what I've found is that you don't just listen to one side of the story. And this is what we do at Megalithomania, a conference. We always have the academics and the alternative people coming in with all their ideas, and like bringing them in together, putting them on the same panel, discussing, arguing if necessary. And we've got somewhere with that now. There's like a change is happening on both sides. Like the alternative people are accepting the brilliant work the archaeologists do. They do fantastic work, they do all the hard work really. And then compared with all the kind of sophisticated research that the alternative people do as well. So I think there's a change slowly happening. But if you go to Stonehenge, and visit it in the visitor centre, they're only going to have what they want you to know, rather than what the bigger story is.
So here you're suggesting there's definitely a controlled narrative surrounding Stonehenge.
Well, I think there is around archaeology in general, and I think there's kind of a reason for that, because there's a way it's taught in colleges and things like that, in universities. They want to maintain this kind of paradigm, and that makes sense. It's like a logical thing, and they want to have a sensible solution to it all. But there's always another side to things, and I think you've got to take a multidisciplinary approach to studying these sites. So you've got to bring in, these different skills to kind of understand what is really going on.
On a personal note, Hugh, do you find it demoralizing when the world of academia kind of steps on your own research or that of a esteemed colleague or peer?
When it comes to what the archaeologists, anthropologists, academics think, I'm really not concerned. It doesn't bother. It used to bother me a little bit, but I'm writing quite obscure stuff. I kind of get really into interesting, odd subjects, which academia aren't going to accept. And I'm at a point where I'm not really concerned what really anyone thinks, to be honest with you. I just get on with it, and I wouldn't waste my time if it wasn't important. You know, I wouldn't focus on anything that didn't grab my attention. I feel needed to be kind of researched and shared. But it can be a challenge because, you know, you can come up with discoveries and things like this, and many of my colleagues have, and they're very, you know, incredibly smart people, genius level, some of them. And, you know, and they put these theories in place, they're really solid, and they get completely ignored and laughed about, you know, by the academics and things like this. So yeah, so there is a problem with that, but I think myself and a lot of my contemporaries are really at a point where we just are going to just keep researching, keep writing, dedicate our time to this kind of thing. And, you know, I always read all the academic stuff. I'm always personally trying to keep up to date with everything about what they're doing and what they're saying. I don't necessarily agree with it all, you know, but, you know, it's got its place just like the alternative side has as well.
Hugh, you mentioned that Stonehenge used to be called the Giant's Dance. Why was this?
Well, there's different theories about why that name came around. It was traditionally in Welsh. There's a few different slight variations, but it generally, in Welsh, it would, I'm not Welsh myself, so it would be Chorea Gigantum, which means the kind of giant's dance, or the giant's kind of movement in a circle. There's other traditions where it's called Council of the Giants and things like this. So there were slight variations on the name given to this particular site. The Cangic giants, who in a book written in 1666 called A Fool's Bolt Soon Shot at Stonehenge by Reverend Robert Gay, who lived in Somerset, he claimed that these Cangic giants built the site as part of a trophy, like a award to themselves for winning this battle against this invading army. And it's said to represent, the circle itself is said to represent a bunch of these giants dancing around in a circle, arm in arm with their heads down. If you imagine what it looks like, it can kind of look like that if you kind of blow your eyes a bit. And so there is that idea that that's one of the reasons why it got that name.
That's fascinating, Hugh. And I'm wondering what the actual energetic function of Stonehenge is. I'm going to pin you down on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got the kind of solar and lunar energies coming in and things like that. That's a given. And its location on the landscape is interesting because if you're looking at it from an astronomical perspective first, before we go into the energetics, it has to be at that latitude for the moon to be recorded in the correct way. It's very odd. It has to be at that latitude. And weirdly, that site was marked 10,000 years ago, which is about 5,000 years before it even properly got built. So they marked it with these giant pine wooden posts in the landscape, which are still, the stumps of them are still kind of were there, and they marked them at the site. So what were they doing 10,000 years ago there, you know? So it was a very special spot even back then. But it's known that this is the work carried out by Guy Underwood and later by John Burke, that it has a huge amount of underground water streams. It has telluric currents coming into the site. There's earth energy currents, there's ley lines going in and out of the site, but these aren't really technically associated with energy, they're more alignments. And what John Burke found, which he wrote about back in 2005 in his book Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty, was the fact that he found an electrical resistivity map of the site that was carried out by archaeologists and noted where all the electric telluric kind of currents were coming in through the main entrance to the northeast with the summer solstice alignment, because that was a flat bit of ground. All the way around it's got a henge, like a ditch. And so these telluric currents can't go 3 feet below the ground. They're stuck kind of just, you know, this much below the ground. And so if they hit a ditch, they kind of follow the path of least resistance until they get a bit of flat ground. And the only bit of flat ground is the entrance. So all the energies were streaming through this particular area, hitting the central stones, which are mainly 5 of these huge trilithons, but also all the blue stones, which are this spotted dolerite crystalline stone that came from Wales, which supposedly had healing properties. And it would charge into the middle, and they found that this central area is where the energy peaks, or peaked, you know, back in prehistoric times. So, and then they found these little pits there as well, which they think had remnants of seeds and grains in them, suggesting they were using this telluric energy, this electric charge kind of thing, and to actually charge the seeds up so they would get better crops and better yields. And this is the kind of thesis that John Burke came up with this remarkable book. And so that we know that for a fact that this was happening there, because the resistivity maps prove it. But also Guy Underwood, long before this, like 20 or 30 years before this, found all these caloric currents and underground water streams all meeting at this spot where energy would then sort of fizz up, through the site. So you can imagine this same energy that is enhancing these seeds and grains can affect your consciousness, and it can stimulate your brain chemistry. And even there could be magnetic effects with the stones as well. It's known that many of the stones have magnetic properties as well. So all this can affect your consciousness. So that could have been part of the ceremonial aspect, or to raise consciousness, as well as a place where you charge your seeds up and you celebrate the turnings of the year. So there's a lot going on at one site, the site of Stonehenge.
Absolutely. And earlier today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Maria Wheatley, who I know you do work with from time to time. And she talked about her discovery of the divine water underneath Stonehenge. Can you add anything to that?
Well, yeah, this is the work of, I think Guy Underwood was the first person to come up with this. And I know Maria got access to his maps and his research, so she's probably kind of the primary researcher on this in the modern era. And I think she might be onto something, because you've got this chalk landscape as well, where you get these aquifers and you get this kind of pure water, you get pure springs in the area as well, and also you've got very clean rivers, like the River Avon that passes close to it, and it's actually connected to it by the avenue. And also, but the aquifers would almost cleanse and charge the water up, because it's being pushed through such tiny channels. And this is what creates electric charge on the surface. So you actually have a kind of mixture of the water and energy kind of affecting what is going on within the stone circle itself.
And also Maria talked about Stonehenge having sort of Akashic record storage capacity. Do you subscribe to that theory?
Yeah, I agree with Maria on most things. I think her work is remarkable, and I think you've got crystalline stones there, like you have in many sites. So we all know, the properties of crystal can record information. It could even potentially release information at times as well. It can be programmed. That's what computers. It's used in computers for such things. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the combination of all these different things, all these subtle technologies that we don't really understand today. We don't have that kind of subtle technology. We have very kind of in-your-face technology. We don't have very subtle things that they were working with the natural elements to kind of manifest what they wanted. And so potentially this is like the energies that are coming into the site are it's like generators by nature. So there's nothing is needed added to it. It just generates it itself just by being there at that particular spot, with the manipulation that was put in there by the builders at the time.
Hugh, what's it like living next to Stonehenge?
Living next to Stonehenge is pretty interesting. Yeah, I live quite close. I live a bit too close, I think, because there's some mounds very close to where we live. These are burial mounds, so we're kind of in the dead zone, it's called by archaeologists. Whereas further away, we have Amesbury and Salisbury, you have the kind of living zone where people actually lived. So yeah, where we live, it's full of interesting, what we could call activity, when it comes to kind of poltergeists, shadow figures, psychic stuff going on, weird effects that we get in the house. And so it's pretty odd, but at the same time, being able to step out and walk into Salisbury Plain and see Stonehenge, just not that far away, is a beautiful thing to be a part of. And so it's given me the opportunity to write a couple of books about this subject and kind of focusing on it. And it's inspired me living there, I must admit. It's been a complete radical change to where I was living before, which was in Glastonbury, which is interesting in its own right. But being near Stonehenge has been very interesting, very intense, but also having the ability to kind of just walk out into the landscape and be a part of it in the modern era is really, really special.
I had a UFO sighting above Stonehenge that actually I documented. I have photographic evidence.
Oh, okay.
What role does Stonehenge play interfacing with the cosmos?
Well, you have things like what you're talking about, strange kind of lights above it. That's been recorded over and over again. I mean, I've had a good friend of mine had an experience, who came to my house right afterwards, where they witnessed a kind of fizzing energy around the stones and around them. And they weren't even in the stone circle, they were kind of all back from it a little bit. And it really, really odd. It was like sort of almost like lightning in the air, just fizzing away, like electric charge kind of thing. And that was a very strange experience for them. And there was no one else at the site at the time, it was in the evening. So that, people who had a direct experience, they almost fainted from it, they said. It was so intense. But there's some people who had electric shocks off the stones in there. It's a lightning attractor as well. It attracts lightning. And the fact that it's aligned to everything, you got to remember, it would have originally had these giant pine totem pole type posts, which probably would have been lightning attractors as well, because you have the right type of geology combined with the underground water and the telluric currents and all this kind of stuff happening. These pine posts would have acted as lightning conductors for sure. Then now you have all the alignments, everything lining up to the moon, the sun, and the stars. It's kind of attracting that kind of energy, if you like, to it, which is kind of the nature of what these sites do. You're not just aligning stuff just to measure stuff, you're actually aligning it to kind of bring down that as well. And so I think Stonehenge was not just like a calendar, just a sort of not a mundane site. It was used ceremonially by the shamans, by the kind of priestly elite, to kind of pull down this energy from the cosmos.
Have you had any experiences of high strangeness at Stonehenge?
Personally, I've had not too much high strangeness myself, but I have a lot of other sites. But living in the house, not too far from Stonehenge, yes, I have. So the stone circle is pretty easygoing. My house isn't. There's like poltergeist activity, kind of things moving around, getting lost, disappearing, electrics being turned off and on, all sorts of stuff. And people knocking on the door, them not being there and things like this, ghostly kind of activity. So I'm sure if you're living inside Stonehenge Stone Circle, you'd probably experience it, at night time, But at the stones itself, I haven't felt too much, but other people have for sure.
Are there any connections between Stonehenge and the Anunnaki, the Watchers, the Nephilim that we've heard a lot about in this expo?
I think there is. I think there's a lot of connections because I found large amount of connections with the Bible lands, which is what I kind of focused on in my lecture. And this is really, really interesting to me because there's this Kangic giants. They could be related to the Canaanites because in name, not just in name, but also there's traditions that there was a giant paraded around near Stonehenge since the 1400s, and this has been called St. Christopher as well. And St. Christopher was a Canaanite giant who came over from the Bible lands. He was part of the Canaanite army, and he wanted to change his ways. He's famous for bringing Jesus across a river on his shoulder when Jesus was a baby. And he became associated with this giant that's paraded around in these pageants just a couple of days after summer solstice on St. John the Baptist Day. And so why is that happening there? And these Kangic giants were said to be associated very closely with the Canaanites for various reasons, not just in name as I mentioned, but also the fact that they had 10 principal commanders in their armies, so did the Kangic giants. But also the skeletal remains and the descriptions of them are very similar. And the earlier tribes, the very early phase of the Kangic giants, they were like semi-divine beings, much like the Anunnaki were before they kind of bred, the Watchers and their kind of cohorts bred with human women in the Bible lands to create the Nephilim giants. And so you have all these strange connections kind of emerging around one particular area. And so it's also when you look at like the geometry, you look at the measurement systems, the metrology, you look at the astronomy, all this kind of stuff. And even stone circle construction was known about in the Bible lands long before Stonehenge was even built. Now we have the geometries of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe being kind of decoded, and I've kind of worked out that they were using the same kind of principles and measurements and geometries as we find in the British stone circles much later. And so how did that happen? Is it a coincidence, or is there a direct influence? And my research suggests there is a very strong influence there, and I'm going to be developing that into a book in due course. And there's also, we must remember that there's DNA evidence coming over from that part of the world, from the Middle East, the Bible lands, southeast Turkey, coming over through Europe over to Britain, and so the influences and now the DNA is all matching up.
Hugh, I'm wondering how the Turkish sites of Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe might relate back to Stonehenge and other British sacred sites.
Yeah, the sites that are being discovered in southeast Turkey are just unbelievable because of the dating of them. I mean, we're talking like between 11 and 12,000 years old. And these are multiple stone circles and enclosures with giant T-shaped pillars forming the main kind of rings, as well as two often in the middle, huge ones, and beautiful relief carvings on them as well, which shouldn't have existed at that time. And I've been finding that the geometries of them, the alignments, even the links between all the sites that are being discovered in the area show incredible geodetic similarities to what we find in ancient Britain. Remarkably similar. So there must have been an influence coming in from that area. Also, we have like the Book of Enoch and the Watchers, or in Sumerian tradition, these were called the Anunnaki and later the Nephilim. And these were a kind of elite kind of group of people who had these very sophisticated ideas of astronomy, agriculture, even geometry, mathematics, metalworking, and everything else you can think of to do with high civilization. And so suddenly the Book of Enoch makes sense now these sites are being discovered, because everything they talk about, the skills these kind of watchers had, are kind of evident in the sites that are being discovered there, and the influence that then they may have caused over in ancient Britain and Europe. And I think we have to take it quite seriously, because there's some parts of the Book of Enoch that clearly talk about Enoch being taken to these high latitudes with this horrific weather, and going to sites and descriptions that appear to match like he's making observations from within stone circles like Stonehenge. There's even descriptions of them possibly at Newgrange as well, so the more you look into this, the more you find these correlations. And also, like this great giant king of ancient Wales was called Idris. Now, Idris is another name for Enoch, so we have that kind of connection there. And I go into that in great detail in a new book, and also I talked about it in the lecture as well. And so that, there's too many things to ignore, and so more research needs to be carried out to kind of prove these connections. But suddenly all these ancient texts that seemed like fairy tales for a long time, now the sites and the archaeology that's coming out of southeast Turkey seems to be backing it up. And so we have to kind of take this seriously now.
Hugh, one of the themes I'm noticing emerging from this event is the lost civilization of Atlantis. Do you believe there's any correlation between Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, and Atlantis?
Yeah, I believe that Atlantis is I'm not into the idea that it was a lost continent in the kind of Atlantic. It's not the way I see it. I see it more as a memory of an advanced civilization that was spread in different places. And it got connected with this whole area along the kind of the eastern side of the Atlantic, which we have in Europe, and the western side, which we have on the coast of the Americas. And so I think it's more of a kind of a memory of possibly a cataclysm that took place, like the Younger Dryas impact event, which has pretty much been proven now. And maybe some land masses were knocked underwater, they were kind of destroyed, but more likely they were small islands and those around the coasts. But the kind of principal ideas and the technology that these ancient civilizations had, like at Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe, and even in ancient Egypt, which goes much further back than people realize, was kind of recorded, and kind of glimpses of the information were held together. And it may have become thought of that it was one big lost continent, but I'm not so sure. So my co-author, Jim Vieira, he's a proper Atlantis guy. He would say there was a landmass, but but I think it's more of a kind of concept and more of a kind of memory of an advanced civilization, which certainly existed back then, but where they are, we don't really know except the little bits of proof we've got coming out of southeast Turkey.
Hugh, I have a question about metrology. What is it and how does it apply to these ancient sites?
So metrology really is just the study of measure, and people don't realize that all these sites, even Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids, Stonehenge, every site you can really think of has a very specific geometry and metrology, which is the measurements, the creation of the site is made in a very specific way. All of these sites are, and it's been proven in the Great Pyramid, it's been proven in Stonehenge, and now we're finding it in Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. And so if they have these specific measurement systems, like for example, you have what's called the megalithic yard. This is found by Alexander Thom, who was a Scottish scholar and engineer. Back in the 60s, he surveyed 600 stone circles in the British Isles and found a kind of unit of measure, which is 2.72 feet or 0.83 meters, which is what you call the megalithic yard. And so he thought, well, there's one actual kind of specific kind of measure that was passed around between these different generations and different areas and recorded into these sites. And it's also, that measurement was also combined, it's very uniform units were used and ratios and things like this to create the sites. So he kind of suggested they were using geometry and this measurement and combining that. Often the sight lines of these geometries were to certain stars or the sun and the moon. So they were combining all these different elements together into one system. But even at Göbekli Tepe, we find the Sumerian foot, we find the Egyptian cubit, we find the Persian foot, the Sumerian palm, and things like this. These are all variations of these measurements that are known from the ancient world. And John Michell and John Neal, and more recently Adam Tetlow, have found they've kind of decoded and unlocked this very specific canon of measure. And all of these measurements are variations of the English foot, like the Sumerian foot, the Persian foot, the British foot. We have many different variations of this, the Belgic foot, the Roman foot, the Saxon. You can make a big list of them. But they're all perfectly harmonious to one another through ratio. And so when you start getting into that, you realize that the ancients not only had this very sophisticated understanding of how to measure the planet, but they also applied that and encoded that into the sites. And so firstly, how do they measure the planet? That's one of the big questions we're still trying to work out. And why did they keep all this information and encode it into large megalithic stone sites like the pyramids, Stonehenge, and like these other areas? And we think it's because it was to do with harmony, and it was to do with geometry, and it was to do with creating like a temple space like you get with cathedrals and so forth. And so we think that's part of it, but also they wanted to provide information to future generations about where they were at the time. And languages come and go, hieroglyphs you can't decode properly, things like this. But number, measurements, and geometry are universal principles that are everywhere.
Do you feel these giants were master astrologers and numerologists?
Yeah, I do. I think the giants are often associated with these advanced techniques of measure, geometry, geodesy, like laying out sites across the landscape, astronomy, and earth measure. I think they were all involved in this. And if you start looking at the traditions in Britain, like we have the tradition of the giant Idris in Wales, we have other giant stories, all the myths about them and the legends encode kind of very sophisticated information about triangulating across the landscape, ley lines across the landscape, even earth energies, and the laying out of sites. Because in traditions they would throw boulders to one spot and then to another. We have the giantess dropping stones from an apron at specific places in dead straight lines. And all these traditions kind of actually encode information about how they built the sites and how they kind of created this harmony, almost like this geomancy or feng shui through the entire landscape.
Hugh, what discovery have you made that was the top paradigm shifter for you?
Well, it's a very recent discovery I'm very proud of, and J.J. Ainsworth was involved in this as well. And she and I visited Karahan Tepe on the winter solstice 2021. This is a very unusual series of events that led us to that particular point in time and that early in that morning. And it's only just been excavated. It's been under the ground for probably 9,000 or 10,000 years. And so I've been visiting the site with Andrew Collins for many years before it was ever excavated, with just these T-pillars sticking out the ground. So we got there as soon as it had been excavated. We got there, we happened to be there on the winter solstice, and we observed the sun 50 minutes after sunrise shining through this porthole stone, this round stone that was kind of partly carved out of the bedrock, and illuminating this stone head, which is carved out of the bedrock inside this special kind of sacred chamber called the pillar shrine, or the AB pit. And as we observed it, the sun moved around the face, illuminating it over about 45 minutes to an hour. And basically, we're probably the first people to witness this in 9,000 or 10,000 years. And we proved that it was aligned to the winter solstice. And we've written an article about it, we've made a video about it. It's going to be coming out in a future publication as well. Andrew and Rodney Hale, who's an archaeoastronomer and engineer, have verified it using various astronomical programs, and it would have actually worked even better in 9000 BC when Karahan was built, and it would have illuminated the face much more clearly. The thing is, it only works on the winter solstice. We checked. No other time of year it works. It reaches that extreme point in the sky before it starts returning, the sun this is, and it just hits the face at that time. And we're also looking at the idea, because that discovery has now been verified, we now think that during the summer solstice, the opposite side of the year, the moon will follow the same path as the sun did on the winter solstice. So the lunar orb, the moon, the brightness of that on a full moon during the time of the summer solstice may actually again shine through the hole and illuminate the head. So it could have been this calendrical, sacred, yearly beginning marker, that was encoded into this site.
That's absolutely fascinating. And again, the winter solstice energies are coming up. How can we harness those energies at this point in the sort of crossroads or precipice that we face as humanity, with threats of World War III and food shortages and more pandemics?
Well, I think when we come to these sites, there's the sites we've been talking about today, there's a lot of ideas we're finding linked with the different times of the year, agricultural calendars, but also the sacredness of it all. And I think we need to return back to the way of thinking of these ancient people, where they were living by the natural technologies coming out from the land, from the sky, from the energies, from the water and things like this. We're so dependent on kind of high technology and petrol or diesel and things like this, or whereas we could be just living a very simple life, growing our own food, utilizing these calendar systems to know when to grow food, keeping clean water and things like this. And I think, to me, that way of living, they had a very, very good understanding of how to grow food, how to survive. And they clearly had spare time on their hands to build all these sites as well. So they spent hundreds of years, over generations, observing the night sky and the sunrises and everything else to create these sites and record all this information into it, so future generations could use these as tools, not just for, calendars and things like that, but actually to enhance consciousness, to remind them and of what was going on back then. And like I said, they encode information. And so no doubt, I believe many of these sites were like memory spaces where their culture's history was encoded into it as well, and performances and song and acoustics and things like this were involved as well. And so this much more simple, earth-based way of life is maybe something we're being forced into because people are just want to turn off from what's happening in society right now, and these elites that are causing all these problems need to kind of be deleted, in my opinion. We need to get back to perhaps a more simple way of life.
And circling back to what you said about Atlantis and the cataclysm, is there a warning for us there?
Well, I think the cataclysm that's going to occur is going to be self-inflicted by the elites that are kind of messing around between each other and kind of starting wars and, creating fake food shortages and, vaccinations, all this kind of weird stuff that's going on. So hopefully that'll all come to an end, and maybe the cataclysm will actually be the end of civilization as we know it, and we'll be forced to go back to this older way of life.
That's a powerful message, Hugh. In conclusion, do you hope that Stonehenge can help humanity somehow take back their power or be a sort of influence of sovereignty in some way?
I think with Stonehenge, why people are so kind of loving it so much, and they still do, I mean, look how many people turn up on the solstice, is that it's a kind of memory stick of like what was happening, what our ancestors were doing. It is like, this is how we used to live, this is what I kind of mentioned, and they want to kind of return to that. They want to return to this much more kind of profound, joyous, simple way of life where, and I want to mention my mentor, John Michel, who passed away a few years ago, he saw sites like Stonehenge and these megaliths as a way of enchanting the landscape. They were like kind of geomantically placed all around the country to bring this kind of harmony and this energy and this even acoustics and singing taking place constantly at all these sites, which he called the circle of perpetual choirs. And I think that's a kind of something to kind of not just focus on as a possible, future, but also it brings people back, like Stonehenge, for instance, brings people back when they visit there and they're celebrating on the solstice to what life could be like every day. We could just be having fun, celebrating, living our life as we should.